Jonas Vural hadn't intended to ride out that day. The sky had already turned heavy by late afternoon, and the cold edge in the wind warned of a storm. But something about the way the air moved, restless, unsettled, pushed him to check the northern fence line anyway. The last thing he needed was more broken wire with winter approaching. He was a man who didn't waste words, and he didn't waste movements either. Everything he did was precise, methodical, just enough to get the job done, no more. 48 years old, live alone on a patch of land that barely qualified as a ranch anymore. Just a few acres of usable pasture, a tired barn, a half-collapsed chicken coop, and a dog too old to bark at anything unless it got real close. Jonas hadn't spoken to another human being in days, maybe weeks. He liked it that way. Ever since Sarah passed from fever nearly 10 years back, he'd let the world shrink. No more towns, no more company, and definitely no more entanglements. Just the land, the quiet, and the silence that followed him like an old shadow. He rode out on his mare, Scout, just past 5 o'clock. The sun was already hiding behind thick gray clouds. The trail was soft, not quite muddy yet, but it would be soon. He could feel it in the tension under Scout's hooves and the smell rising from the dry grass as the first drops started to fall. The fence looked fine. He almost turned back right there, but then he noticed something at the bend in the road, about 100 yards down. A shape, too still to be a log. Wrong color for a deer. He slowed Scout to a stop. Listened. Wind and rain. Nothing else. He nudged the mare forward. As he drew closer, the shape took form. A woman, sitting in the mud, legs tucked underneath, her back against the slope, arms limp. She was covered in grime. Her clothes were soaked through, a thin dress clinging to her frame, torn at the shoulder. One boot missing, the other half buried in the muck. Her hair, reddish, maybe though it was hard to tell through the mud, hung down her face in thick, wet strands. Jonas reined in and dismounted slowly. He didn't speak right away. He didn't rush forward. Too many years dealing with spooked animals, and worse, spooked people. He approached cautiously, steps heavy in the mud, boots sinking. The woman turned her head slightly. Her face was pale under the dirt. Her eyes, though, those were sharp, alert, even if hollowed out by exhaustion. She looked at him like a cornered animal. Not pleading, not afraid exactly, just waiting to see what kind of man he was. Jonas said nothing at first, just stood a few feet away, taking in the scene. She was shivering. Her hands were raw, scraped, maybe from fall. No pack, no horse. She hadn't just stumbled here from nearby. She'd walked a long way. "You hurt?" he asked, voice low and rough. His throat always felt like it had gravel in it, especially when he hadn't spoken for a while. She didn't answer. "Where you coming from?" he asked. Still nothing. He crouched, careful not to get too close. The rain was coming down harder now. "Storm will be bad," he said, not as a warning, just a fact. He could already feel the water seeping through the seams of his coat. "Can't stay out here." She turned her face away, jaw tight. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. He stood, looked back toward the rise where his cabin sat, just barely visible through the trees. He rubbed his jaw with a gloved hand, thinking, this wasn't what he came out here for. He didn't want this. A stranger. A woman with unknown trouble. But he also couldn't leave her. He pulled his coat off and draped it around her shoulders. She flinched at first, tensed, but didn't pull away. The coat swallowed her. He didn't offer to lift her. Didn't reach down. Just waited. After a long minute, she tried to stand. Slipped. Tried again. Jonas stepped in and steadied her with one arm, careful and slow, like handling a half-broke colt. "You'll sleep in my house tonight," he said. It wasn't a question. The cabin wasn't much, just a one-room structure with a kitchen nook, a cast-iron stove, a small bed, and a pile of split firewood by the door. It smelled like cedar and dust and dry coffee. The dog, Old Bo, looked up from his corner by the fire and gave a low grunt, but didn't rise. Jonas brought her in, sat her on the edge of the bed, and stoked the fire. The wood popped and hissed as it caught. He moved around the space, quiet but focused, fetching towels, dry socks, a wool blanket. She still hadn't said a word. She hadn't even asked his name. He didn't press. There was too much fear on her face. Not the kind that came from the cold or the storm. The kind that came from being hunted. He handed her a cup of warm water and then turned his back to give her space to peel off the wet clothes. He heard the faint rustle behind him, a pause, then the weight of her body sinking into the bed. She stayed upright, didn't lie down, kept her back to the wall. He noticed that too. Jonas moved to the stove. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy, though, full of questions neither of them asked. He poured 2 mugs of leftover stew from the morning, beans and venison, and handed her one. She held it, let the heat soak in her fingers. Didn't eat right away. Finally, a few quiet bites. When she set the bowl down, he caught her eyes again. "I'm not going to ask," he said. "Not tonight." She blinked once. "You're safe here," he added, "for as long as you want to be." That wasn't something Jonas said to anyone. Not for years. But when she nodded, small, almost unnoticeable, it felt like the right thing. Not just pity, not charity, a choice. Outside, the wind slammed against the shutters. But inside, the fire kept burning. Warm, steady. 2 strangers sat on opposite ends of a room that had only ever held one chair, one bed, one way of living. Now everything had changed. The storm eased by morning, but the air stayed cold. Mist clung to the trees around the cabin like a second skin, and everything smelled of wet earth and smoke. Jonas was up early like always. He moved quietly, boots scuffing the floorboards, stirring the stove back to life with dry pine he'd stored under the sink. As he worked, he glanced toward the bed. She was still there, Asia. That was the name she finally gave, quietly, barely above a whisper, when he set the second blanket on her sometime after midnight. Just her first name, nothing else. No town, no family, no explanation. He didn't ask for more. She was asleep now, or close to it. Eyes closed, breathing shallow. Still fully clothed, wrapped in both blankets, curled near the wall with her knees drawn up tight. She hadn't moved much in the night. He didn't blame her. Jonas poured water into the tin kettle and set it on the stove. His hands were steady, but his mind wasn't. He hadn't had another person in his house overnight in years. Not since his brother stopped visiting. Not since Sarah. He didn't regret bringing Asia in, but he didn't know what came next either. Bo, the dog, got up slowly, stretched, and limped across the floor to sniff near the bed. Asia stirred slightly. Her hand shifted under the blanket, tense. Bo sat tongue out and waited. Jonas cleared his throat gently. He don't bite. She didn't open her eyes, but her body relaxed a little. Bo lay down. They didn't talk over breakfast. Jonas made eggs and pan-fried cornbread in a cast-iron skillet. He slid a plate toward her on the table. She watched him for a long moment before getting up. Still wary, still quiet. She sat at the edge, fork barely making noise as she ate. He could tell she hadn't had a warm meal in days. Weeks, maybe. She didn't rush, but she didn't waste a bite either. Afterward, she helped without being asked. Clear the dishes. Rinse them with cold water at the basin. He watched from the window as the sun started to break through the fog. The fields were soaked, the corral half-flooded, but nothing broken. He put on his coat and reached for his hat. She turned at the door. "You'll be back." He stopped, hand on the latch. Her voice was rough, like it hadn't been used in a while. Her eyes were wide, unsure. "Be back before noon," he said simply. "You'll be all right." She didn't answer, just nodded once, slow and stiff. When he returned, she had swept the floor and started a fire without help. His old tin kettle was clean. She'd found a shirt of his, too big, and changed into it. Her wet dress hung near the stove, steam rising from the sleeves. He didn't say anything. He just noticed. That afternoon passed quietly. He repaired some fencing. She stayed inside. When he came in to wash up, he saw the window had been covered with an old quilt, tacked over with nails, crude but deliberate. That told him more than words could. She didn't want to see outside, or be seen. That night, they sat on opposite ends of the table. He cleaned a rifle. She mended a rip in the sleeve of a coat he hadn't worn in months. No one asked why. It didn't matter. Jonas had questions. Of course he did. He wondered where she came from, what she was running from, who might come looking. But he also knew what it felt like to have the weight of something too big to explain. He didn't need her story to know she needed space. That night, she didn't sleep in the bed. She curled up on the floor, between the stove, and Bo Jonas saw her fold a blanket twice over herself and rest her back against the woodpile. She hadn't asked to stay longer, but she hadn't left either. 3 days passed, then 5. She didn't talk much, but she helped with everything. Dishes, chores, feeding the chickens. She started folding the laundry before he noticed she'd even washed it. She set a tin cup out beside his plate every evening, always in the same place. He noticed the way she flinched less when the wind knocked a branch against the roof. He noticed she started sleeping in the bed, still fully clothed, still near the wall, but off the floor. She even scratched Bo behind the ears once when she thought he wasn't looking. On the 6th day, she stood beside him as he chopped wood. She didn't say anything, just handed him another log when he finished with one. Her hands were blistered. She didn't complain. That night, while they ate, he finally asked, "You got someone looking for you?" Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth. She didn't move. He watched her shoulders rise, tense, then drop again slowly. "Not anymore," she said. That was all. He didn't ask again. Asia wasn't just surviving anymore. She was settling, bit by bit. She still didn't speak much, still avoided windows, still jumped if he walked too quietly behind her. But she stayed, and Jonas didn't mind the extra plate, or the clean floor, or the quiet company. He found himself making sure the stove never went out at night, cutting more firewood than he needed, fixing the fence near the house even though it didn't really need fixing. He wasn't sure what it meant. Not yet, but it felt real, like something worth keeping. The wind shifted in the second week of October. Nights came sooner, and the mornings were colder. Jonas started bringing in more firewood before dusk, stacking it higher than usual near the door. Asia noticed. She didn't ask questions. She just added another quilt to the bed and began boiling water earlier each morning so the wash basin wouldn't freeze over. There was a rhythm now. It wasn't spoken or planned. It just happened. She rose when he rose, ate what he put on the table, took the broom before he thought to mention it. She kept to her side of the room, and he respected the invisible lines she'd drawn early on. But the quiet wasn't empty anymore. It was full of things that didn't need words. One night, as the sun dropped low behind the trees and the last bit of warmth left the cabin, Jonas sat by the fire, sharpening his old skinning knife. He didn't need it much anymore. He rarely hunted these days, but the habit was old. Something about the feel of the whetstone, the clean drag of steel across it, settled his mind. Asia sat at the table, mending another shirt he hadn't worn in years. She never asked who the clothes belonged to. She just cleaned and fixed whatever she found in the old trunk by the window. "Was it your wife's?" she asked suddenly, eyes still on the stitching. Jonas paused. The knife edge rested flat on the stone. He didn't look up. "Yeah," he said after a beat. "Sarah." Silence again. The fire popped once. "Is that why you live out here?" Her voice was soft, unsure if she should have spoken. Jonas nodded once, then said, "Part of it." She didn't press, but it opened something. He set the knife down, leaned back in the chair, hands resting on his thighs. The firelight caught the side of his face, lining every crease. His voice came low. Used to be a different man. Rode with a few others, back when there was work for men with a fast hand. Called it security, stage lines, bank runs, that sort of thing. He paused. Bo shifted in his corner. Wasn't always clean work. Plenty of bad came with the good. Met Sarah in a town south of Laramie. She worked in a bakery. I don't know what she saw in me, but she stayed. We got a piece of land out here. Started over. Asia looked up for the first time in a while. "What happened?" "She got sick," Jonas said flatly. "Fever. Took her in 2 days." There wasn't anything else to say. No dramatic story. No revenge. Just loss. "I stopped carrying a gun after that," he added. "Figured I'd had enough of making things worse." Asia nodded. Not in sympathy, more like understanding. Later that week, she surprised him again. They were in the shed, fixing the roof before the next rain. She was holding a board steady while he hammered. He looked down to check the alignment and saw her sleeve shift back. Faint bruises still marked her wrist. Faded now, but unmistakable. He didn't say anything then. But that night, he brought the revolver out from its box in the trunk. He cleaned it quietly at the table while she watched from across the room. He didn't look up when he spoke. "If anyone ever comes for you, I'll deal with it. She stared at him for a long time. Her mouth twitched like she wanted to say something, but she didn't. Just nodded once and stood, quietly folding a towel in the kitchen. Jonas didn't need to know the details. He'd seen enough bruises in his life to know what they meant. But she gave him more in pieces. I taught children, she said one evening without warning. He looked up from his chair, where he was patching a worn saddle strap. In Missouri. Second grade. He said nothing, just waited. My husband didn't like me working. Said it made him look weak. First he just said things. Then it turned into more. She traced the rim of her cup. The fire cast long shadows across the floor. I left when I could. Took the back road. Been walking for days when you found me. Jonas absorbed the words in silence. He didn't say how close to death she'd looked. How much smaller she seemed back then. But now she stood straighter. Her eyes were clearer. She still jumped at sudden sounds. Still avoided open windows after dark. But she moved with more confidence now. She helped mend the barn doors. She carried buckets from the well without asking. She didn't flinch when Bo barked at night anymore. Jonas noticed. One night, as frost settled over the fields and they sat in silence after dinner, Asia turned to him. Why didn't you ask where I came from that night? Jonas looked up from his coffee. His hands were wrapped around the tin cup, steam curling between his fingers. Didn't need to, he said. You were cold. You were hurt. That was enough. She didn't reply, but he saw her shoulders ease. That was the night she took the quilt down from the window. Neither of them said anything about it. But Jonas slept lighter that night, and Asia didn't wake once. By the end of the month, the first snow touched the edges of the field. Just a dusting. But it stayed, and so did she. The snow didn't stay long that first time, but it was enough to shift how everything moved. The air turned thinner, sharper. The trees stood bare. The soil hardened underfoot. Jonas began working shorter days outside, spending more time in the shed cutting firewood, checking supplies. Asia stayed close, always watching, always listening. They didn't talk much still. They didn't need to. They shared tools, passed each other the salt, moved around each other like they'd done it for years. But there were new moments now, quiet things that hadn't happened before. She started humming. Not loud, just faintly when she thought he wasn't paying attention, while she stirred something in the pot, or when she swept by the door. It wasn't a song he recognized. It might not have been a song at all, but the sound carried, and it made the cabin feel different. Jonas heard it once while cleaning his rifle near the window. It stopped as soon as the floor creaked beneath his boot. She turned, half guilty. Didn't mean to, she said quietly. Didn't mind it, he answered. That night she laughed. Only once, and it was small but real. Bo had slipped chasing a chicken near the coop and landed flat on his side in the snow. Asia doubled over, hand to her chest. Jonas stood still, watching her, like he wasn't sure what he was seeing. She caught him staring. What? Nothing, he said, but he thought about that laugh for hours afterward. In early November, Jonas brought down 2 old saddles from the barn rafters. One was Sarah's. Asia brushed the dust from the leather carefully, her fingers tracing the worn edges. You know how to ride? He asked. She hesitated. I've been on a horse. Not often. Good place to start, then. They rode the next morning just down the fence line. Slow. Careful. Scout was steady. The second mare, Dusty, was older but still responsive. Jonas rode beside her, one eye on the horse, the other on Asia. She didn't speak during the ride, but her body relaxed as the minutes passed. The rhythm, the movement, the space, it gave her something she hadn't had in a long time. When they got back, she smiled again. Not to anyone, just to herself. Later that week, she asked him for a patch of land behind the shed. For what? He asked. Garden. In spring. He nodded. The ground was frozen now, but it didn't matter. Planning meant staying. That night, he left a pistol on the table. Cleaned, oiled. Small enough to fit in her hand. Don't have to use it, he said. But you should know how. She stared at it for a while. Didn't touch it. Just whispered, thank you. He nodded once and returned to stirring the coals in the stove. The next morning, she picked it up and followed him outside. Jonas set up old tin cans on a log out back. They took turns. She missed at first. Flinched on the third shot. Hit one dead center on the sixth. Not bad, he said. She looked at him sideways. I wasn't aiming. He smirked just barely. She started sleeping more soundly after that. Her eyes didn't dart around so much during meals. She looked people in the eye, him, the dog, the trees. Jonas noticed. One morning, he found her standing at the edge of the woods behind the house. Arms crossed, breath visible in the morning chill. "You all right?" he asked, stepping up beside her. "I thought I heard something last night," she said. "What kind of something?" She shook her head. "Just a sound. Wind, maybe." Jonas scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. Just the silence of the hills, the distant creak of old branches. "If it was more than wind," he said, "they'd never get close without me knowing." She didn't answer right away. "Then I believe that." They walked back together, side by side, not saying anything else. That afternoon, she cleared the snow off the porch without being asked. When she was done, she stood there looking out, arms around her waist. "This place," she said quietly, "feels like something that used to be alive." Jonas stood behind her. "It still is." She looked back. For the first time, he saw something in her eyes that wasn't fear or weariness. It was possibility. And for the first time in years, he felt it too. It started with wind. Not the usual restless prairie gusts, but a sharp, violent push of cold that swept down from the mountains in the early hours before dawn. Jonas felt it before he heard it. The pressure in the walls, the shifting groan of the roof beams. Then came the snow. Heavy, wet, fast. By sunrise, the world was white. He didn't like the look of it. Snow this early in the season never lasted long, but it fell hard enough to damage. He saddled up without eating, threw on his duster, and told Asya he'd be back in an hour. "The north pasture," he said, grabbing his gloves. "That gate's been loose." She looked out the window. The snow was already piling against the fence posts. "Shouldn't wait?" she asked. "Can't," he replied. "Too close to the edge. If the gate blows open, we lose the cattle." She handed him a flask without a word. "Hot tea." He took it and nodded once. He didn't make it back in an hour. By noon, Asya was pacing the cabin. Bo stood by the door, ears twitching. The snow kept falling. She set another log on the fire, then paced again. Another hour passed. She opened the door and stepped out. Visibility was low. She pulled Jonas's second coat around her shoulders, still stiff from disuse, and started toward the pasture. The path wasn't visible. She followed Scout's tracks as far as she could, then relied on memory. She found him just before the ridge. He was half-sitting, one leg folded under, back against a dead tree. His horse stood nearby, reins tangled in a bush. Jonas's face was pale, jaw tight. Snow covered his shoulders. "I slipped," he said, as she knelt beside him. She saw the angle of his ankle. It was wrong. "Can you stand?" "Not without seeing stars." She looked around. No one was coming. No help within 10 miles. "We'll get back," she said. "You'll lean on me." Jonas gave a half laugh, more pain than amusement. "You'll break. Try me." It took nearly an hour to walk back. Jonas leaned heavy on her shoulder, his weight forcing her into the snow with every step. She didn't complain. Not once. Her arms trembled. Her jaw clenched tight. But she kept moving. By the time they reached the cabin, she was soaked to the knees, breathing hard, hair frozen in stiff strands. She helped him into the chair near the fire, stripped off his coat, pulled off the boot, slow, careful, biting her lip when he groaned. The ankle was swollen and dark, maybe broken, maybe just twisted. She didn't know. She cleaned the wound, wrapped it tight, and set water to boil. She moved without hesitation, faster than Jonas had ever seen her. He watched her work, pain lining his face. "You done this before?" "I was a nurse before I taught," she said, not looking up. It was the first time she'd mentioned that. For the next 2 days, he didn't leave the chair. She brought food, changed the bandage, checked his fever. She read aloud from an old almanac just to fill the silence. Her voice was steady, stronger than it had been since the day he found her. Jonas didn't say much. He hated being useless, but he let her take over. And Asya, for the first time since she arrived, looked like she belonged in the space. Not a guest, not a burden, something closer to an equal. On the third night, he woke to a noise, something outside. Maybe wind, maybe not. He reached for his rifle, but stopped when he saw her. Asya was already at the window. One hand held the pistol he'd given her. Her posture was straight, no shaking. She watched the darkness for a long minute. Then she lowered the weapon. "Just wind," she said, returning to the fire. He watched her walk back to her blanket. He didn't stop her, didn't ask how she knew. He believed her. Before lying down, she looked at him. "You ever wonder," she said, "why I stopped running?" He didn't answer right away. "Because it felt like dying," she said quietly. "And then this place, it didn't." Jonas looked at the fire, his voice low. "It still might. Hurt don't vanish out here." "I know," she said, "but I'd rather be here, with someone who doesn't look away." They didn't speak again that night. The fire burned low. Outside, the storm passed. Inside, the silence wasn't empty. And when morning came, Assia was the first to rise, and Jonas found himself watching her like he was seeing her for the first time. The days had turned crisp. Snow clung only to the edges of the trees now, melting slow under weak sunlight. Jonas's ankles still ached, but he'd started moving around again, slow, with a cane he cut from an aspen branch. Assia didn't hover, but she kept pace beside him every time he limped across the yard. Life had started to feel steady. She'd cleared the patch behind the shed, just like she said she would, even though the soil was still hard and crusted with frost. He'd watched her, sleeves rolled up, fingers raw, sweat on her brow, and realized she'd made a decision to stay without ever saying the words. Then came the rider. It was early afternoon, a dull gray light overhead. Assia was inside stripping herbs for drying. Jonas had just finished stacking chopped wood when he heard the hooves, slow, deliberate, heavy. He looked up. A man approached down the narrow trail. Tall, broad-shouldered, riding a dark horse that kicked up frost with each step. He wore a flat-crowned hat, long coat, dust-covered boots. His horse looked well-fed, well-trained. The kind of man who didn't come by accident. Assia stepped out onto the porch when she heard it. She froze mid-step. Jonas saw the way her fingers curled into the doorframe. She didn't speak, but her face drained of color. The rider stopped 20 feet out, said nothing. Jonas stepped forward, cane tucked under his arm, rifle slung loose behind his back but close. "Something you need?" he asked. The rider looked past him. At her. "Assia," he said. Her name hung in the cold air. She didn't answer. "You've been running long enough." Still silence. "You know who this is?" Jonas asked, not taking his eyes off the man. She nodded once, barely visible. "Don't want to go with him?" he asked again, quieter. "No." Jonas stepped forward slowly. His leg ached, but he stood tall. "She stays." The rider's jaw worked side to side. His hand drifted toward his belt, close, not drawn. "I don't think you understand what's happening," the man said. Jonas didn't move. "Understand enough," he replied. The two men stared each other down. Behind them, Assia stepped off the porch. She held the pistol. Calm. Both hands. Jonas saw her out of the corner of his eye. The rider noticed too. His eyes narrowed. "She gonna shoot me?" "No," Jonas said. "She's going to wait and see if she has to." The tension stretched thin. The only sound was the soft creak of leather, wind shifting through the branches, the distant whistle of a hawk. Then the rider blinked, looked at her one last time. There was something in his face, not anger, disbelief. Like he couldn't understand how she'd come to this place, how she'd found someone who would stand there for her without question. He turned the horse with a sharp tug and rode back the way he came. No words, no threats, just retreat. Assia stood there long after the rider disappeared into the trees. Jonas walked over slow. "You all right?" She nodded, still gripping the pistol. "I didn't think I could do that," she said quietly. "You didn't have to." "I did." He looked at her, at the way she stood firm now, at the steadiness in her breath. "I don't know who he was," Jonas said, "and I don't care, but he's not coming back." Assia stared at the tree line. "No, he won't." They sat by the fire that night without speaking. Bo curled between them, head on his paws. Outside, the wind had calmed. Inside, something else had changed. She took down the second curtain that night, the last one, and when she went to sleep, she didn't check the door twice. Didn't carry the pistol to bed. Jonas watched the flames burn low. He knew the world wouldn't stop throwing storms their way. He'd lived too long to believe otherwise. But this one? They'd faced it. Together. Spring returned slower than expected. The thaw took weeks. The earth held tight to its frost, reluctant to soften. But it did, one layer at a time. Jonas's limp remained, but he no longer needed the cane. By the time the fields turned a pale green and the first wildflowers poked up along the fence posts, he'd taken to walking the full property again. Asia often joined him, not always close, but always within view. The land was still quiet, still hard, but it didn't feel so empty anymore. The garden behind the shed started to take shape. Asia worked it each morning, digging, planting, adjusting. She'd never grown much before, she admitted, just herbs and windowsills. But here, she had space. Jonas built her a small fence around it, not to keep animals out, just to mark the boundary, a place of her own. They shared meals every evening, still mostly in silence. But it wasn't awkward. It was full, comforting. Her chair never went empty. His coffee cup always had a second one beside it. One morning, she stepped onto the porch with bare feet, a blanket around her shoulders, hair down. Jonas was already outside, sharpening a hoe. He looked up. "You sleep all right?" he asked. "Better than I ever have." They didn't speak more. They didn't need to. The next week, she took the dog out with her. Bo followed her across the field, limping less than usual, tail up. She tossed him sticks near the creek. He barked, tail wagging, chasing him like he was young again. Jonas watched from the window. His face didn't change much, but his eyes lingered. That afternoon, he brought out a new saddle blanket, stitched by Asia from old shirts and scrap cloth. He laid it across Dusty's back and called her over. "You ready to ride again?" She smiled, not just with her mouth, with her whole body. "Yeah," she said. "Let's go." They rode out across the edge of the property. Snowmelt filled the low spots. Trees were blooming. The wind carried scent, damp earth, wildflowers, sun-warmed pine. They didn't say much, but they stopped often. Not to rest, but to look, to see. At one stop, they sat side by side on a fallen log. Asia looked out toward the hills. "Does it ever go away?" she asked. "What?" "The part that remembers." Jonas ran a hand over his jaw. "No," he said honestly, "but it quiets down." She nodded, eyes still forward. "I used to think I'd never stop running," she said. "Now, I think I just needed somewhere to stand still." She turned toward him. "You gave me that." Jonas didn't answer at first. Then he said, "You stayed?" "That wasn't me. That was you." Back at the cabin, the day ended slow and soft. They sat on the porch, mugs in hand. Bo rested at their feet. The sky turned orange, then pink, then that pale blue before dark. A hawk circled high above the ridge. The land stretched quiet around them. Jonas looked over at her. "You think about leaving?" She shook her head. "No, this is home now." He nodded. There was no need for anything more. No ceremony, no grand moment. Just two people who had every reason not to trust the world, who stayed anyway. As the sun dipped below the hills, she leaned slightly against his shoulder. He didn't move, just let her rest there. And for the first time in a very long while, the house behind them didn't feel haunted. The silence wasn't filled with ghosts or regrets. It was filled with warmth and presence. They had both lost more than most could carry, but they had chosen to stay, to witness, to build something new from the pieces. And that was enough.